Hello everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the GeneaVlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I will be reacting to Cuban Ancestry DNA results by Rockin' Woodworks. I am kind of familiar with this channel. He does woodworking stuff, which, fits with the name. Haven't really seen a whole lot. I think I've seen like one or two videos pop up. He's a somewhat small channel, 11.4 thousand. But I think this will be quite interesting because with Cuban DNA results, you can usually find a pretty good mixture of different things. For Cuban Ancestry, I would expect he'll probably have a good amount of European, would expect probably some sort of Native American in there. Definitely would not be surprised if there's some sort of African ancestry in there as well. But I'm guessing when it comes to the European, it's probably going to have a good amount of Iberian, so Spanish or Portuguese. But it's also possible he might have a good amount of Jewish ancestry as well, because I do know that there are a good amount of Cubans who will get Jewish ancestry in their results. But one thing that'll be interesting is if he will show any of his matches, because Cubans, in my experience, often have a good amount of endogamy that they're dealing with. And this is somewhat common in a lot of the DNA results that I've looked at where they are coming from some sort of island. So places like Puerto Rico, Cuba, Jamaica. But I'm not going to talk too much more, although before we do jump into the video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. It really does help me out. Also, be sure to subscribe and click that bell for notifications on future videos. But with all of that fun stuff said, let's jump into the video.
So I tested with Ancestry DNA. If you're wanting to go to the results right away, I'll leave you a timestamp right now. But stick with me so I can give you a little background, and then we'll go right to the DNA results.
Background is always good because it gives you a place to start with in understanding the results.
So I was born in Miami. My folks were born in Cuba, and naturally I carry over their DNA, and they carry their folks' DNA and forefathers and so on, and it just goes back in time, right?
Yeah.
So what's that all about? So Wikipedia writes, the majority of Cubans descend from Spaniards. Despite its multi-ethnic composition, the culture held together in common by most Cubans is referred to as mainstream Cuban culture. Never called it that, I've never heard it, but a Western culture largely derived from the traditions of Western European immigrants or migrants, beginning with the early Spanish settlers along with other Europeans arriving later but in much smaller numbers, such as the English, the French, and Italians. There is a West African cultural component which has been somewhat influential, with many Afro-Cubans also being of Jamaican and other Afro-Caribbean origin. So I've been doing family tree research, ancestry research.
Best way to go about it. So he already has a step ahead in the game in understanding the results, and we can see he's actually he has a pretty well built out tree. It's built out to, he has all of his great grandparents, he has almost all of his second great grandparents. Although now that I'm kind of looking at it a bit closer, I noticed that a lot of the second great grandparents just seem to be surnames. So I'm wondering, are those brick walls, or did he just kind of put the surnames as just kind of a quick filler? But it does seem that a lot of them have these arrows on the right. And if you notice, there's these 5 where it's kind of colored in, and then these where they're not. Well, if they're colored in, that means that when you click that, there are further ancestors. So presumably all of these ones with the darker gray box with the little arrow, those ones we would presumably have more ancestors. So he's already got off to a great start with this. Let's keep looking.
And I've been doing that for about a year. Now, there's a lot of family oral history, and as I've done my research and collected documents I would never have thought that I would come across, they match, for the most part, consistent with the oral history that I was taught by my parents, grandparents, and so on.
I think that's pretty consistent for a lot of people. When you have family lore, there's often some sort of hint of truth with it. But it makes sense. Over time, things will change. People don't get everything right with the story. People will elaborate. People will, make the story a bit more grandiose over time. Especially if someone lives during a time where, it really seems cool to make something sound a certain way. Plus, if anyone's ever played the game of telephone where, you sit in a line with a whole bunch of people and someone says one thing, whispers one thing into one person's ear and they keep whispering it from one person to the other, by the time it gets to the end, it's completely different just because of that change over it. So in a sense, when you're dealing with these family stories, there is this telephone game of time. So I honestly think it's a bit more surprising when someone is able to prove a family story to a T where everything is exactly correct. But I think in all honesty, most of the time, it's just like this. It's correct for the most part.
In the case of my direct line, my parents, both parents born in Cuba. I was born here. My two parents born in Cuba. My grandparents one was a Spaniard, and the other three were Cuban. So I have 8 great grandparents, right? 5 were born in Spain, 3 in Cuba. The Cubans were born specifically in Matanza, Cuba, Cienfuegos, Cuba. And for the Spaniards, that was Santander, Cantabria, Spain. And
so he's northern Spain, which I think might be interesting to see, being that he has northern Spain. Will he get any sort of readings that would be a bit more like French and German? So with a lot of great-grandparents coming from Spain specifically, we probably won't expect Native American or African ancestry being mixed in from there. Through the 3 great-grandparents he said who were born in Cuba, there is still that possibility. But with the Spanish great-grandparents, there is a question: do they all come from Spain, or are some of them actually coming from other areas?
Malaga, Andalusia, Spain, and then the Canary Islands, Spain. So that makes up my great grandparents. And so those geographic locations continue on going back. But as you further go back, at least in my case, it becomes a little bit more difficult to document. I do want to mention that one of my great grandparents is of Sicilian origin. Family history, oral tradition, but it's something so known throughout that I just don't have the documentation of that person. There's a whole story with that, but supposedly Sicilian. And let me continue here.
I guess the question I have with that is, he saying that that ancestor was fully Sicilian, or that they just had supposed Sicilian in their ancestry? Which makes sense, because you think about it, you have 8 great-grandparents, but then they all have 8 great-grandparents. So it's possible if that great-grandparent of his had a great-grandparent of Sicilian ancestry, that could be a story that would then be passed down. But that would also mean that we aren't going to be sure if he'll get any sort of reading from that Sicilian, because a great-grandparent's great-grandparent is a 4th great-grandparent. So your 4th great-grandparents are your great-grandparents' great-grandparents. So if he gets, that 1% or something of Italian, that could be where it's coming from.
So to wrap this bit up, Cuba is a multi-ethnic culture, just like the U.S., but in Cuba, the base sort of starting point, European origin is Spain. So that's its base. Whereas in the U.S., British as a base, and then a multitude of ethnicities and people from all.
I will say, everyone kind of thinks British is a base for the U.S., but not really. It's such a huge mix. The reason why people think British is a base is because, with the colonies, and they broke away from England. But when you go all over the U.S., depending on where you are, it's completely different base populations. If you go down to Louisiana, that's going to be a very different base population than if you go up to Minnesota. And then if you go down to Kansas and all the other places, you have some places where it's huge German influence, other places where it's huge Swedish and Nordic influences. So I get his point, but it's just a quick aside I want to say, because a lot of people do kind of think that, English is the base in the US. And I guess if you look at the whole of the U.S., that would probably be fairly common. Although I wonder if anyone's ever actually done anything to kind of get an idea. But it's much more nuanced than just English as a base.
You get, and all these sites that you see, most of them, you'd have to do the research to see which ones, but they offer you a matching results where people that have taken it, that are in their system, their data system, they'll match you, and you can see how many the numbers of people that match with you at whatever level of DNA.
Best part of the DNA.
There is it's a jaw-dropping thing to see how many people one is related to, be it how far distant or whatnot. They all branch into a common person at one point. Sometimes those things can unlock your family tree where you're missing a name, and by hook or crook you can arrive at the answer to that missing sort of person in your tree. So my ethnicity results are 43% Spain.
Okay.
26.
Okay, so it's pretty interesting. He has all European. It doesn't seem like he has any small percentages of Native American or African, which, like I was saying, I would expect at least a little bit. But with him saying that the majority of his great-grandparents were coming from Spain directly, it does make a bit more sense, because with the other great-grandparents that weren't coming from Spain, that were from Cuba, well, maybe they weren't that far removed from Spain themselves, and because of that, there just really isn't any mixture in there. But it's still really interesting to see how much of a mixture there is, because we have 43% Spain, 26% Portugal. We have 22% France, which I was saying, based on the fact that he had family from Santander up in the northern parts of Spain, which is right near the Basque region. Would there be any sort of French coming from that, being so close in proximity? Well, maybe that's where that French is coming from. We're also seeing the 6% Italian, which he was talking about having Sicilian ancestry, so that could be coming from there. And then we do have a 3% Ireland and Scotland, which he didn't seem to indicate any known connection to Ireland and Scotland. But there is a possibility that maybe there's a connection between the whole Santander French sort of thing and Ireland and Scotland. But I should say that all of what I'm saying, this is just kind of hypothesizing where all of this could come from. It might not be exactly where we think it's coming from, but when you do hypothesize like this, when you then go and look into the genealogy and try to trace your family tree, like he's saying that he wants to do, then understanding and coming up with these hypotheses can help in furthering your actual research. The true way to do it would be through his genetic matches, which I hope he does talk about, but let's hear what he has to say about his results.
So to me, the Spain result makes sense, since this is the oral history handed down from my father and grandparents.
His Iberian adds up to 69%. So basically, from what he had said, I think 5 of his 8 great-grandparents were from Spain directly. I think that's what he said. Maybe I have that a little off. So that would make sense, because 5 out of 8, that's just about 3/4. But granted, the other 3 great-grandparents likely had some sort of connection to Spain or Portugal. So it's doubtful that those 5 Spanish great-grandparents represent all of that 69%, more than likely coming from all of his 8 great-grandparents, and there's just this huge mix. But all right, let's keep going.
Parents and mother, and it just goes on, and it's just like one of those things that's as obvious as can be, right? So now, I didn't originally expect Portugal, because, well, I just didn't consider it at all, but it's the Iberian Peninsula, and it does make total sense to me. It would have to be somewhere down the line, or at least common heritage, so that I don't know. But
one thing to consider too, it's not necessarily that, he has this Portuguese ancestry in any sort of recent time. It could also just be the fact that the Portuguese and Spanish population groups are just so similar that it's really difficult to truly tell them apart. And so some of his Spanish DNA is actually just being read as Portuguese, just because it's so common that they thought, well, maybe it's more Portuguese. Not all the websites seem to try to decipher Spain from Portugal. I know that some of the websites just will say Iberia, With this one being from Ancestry, this is from September 2019, so literally 2 years old. So there's been multiple updates. So I would be kind of curious, what do the new updates say? I actually don't know how they define Spain and Portugal, if it's still just Spain and Portugal, or if it's Iberia, or how they changed it. Because they'll change the names of the population groups as well.
Long story short, it's Iberian Peninsula.
Yeah.
And so Portugal was a surprise, but then thinking about it, it's like, oh yeah, well, absolutely, totally makes sense.
Now, as you think of the French.
With that said, Italy, which I have that one connection with a great-grandparent, and so there's that oral tradition, I just can't hammer it down, but it's in the DNA, so it must be from there. Can't prove it until one connects the actual documentation, but...
Yeah, I wouldn't say it must be from there. It certainly could be from there. If the great-grandparent was half Sicilian, meaning his most recent fully Sicilian ancestor was a second great-grandparent, that actually matches up exactly with 6%. Because for a great-grandparent, we're expecting 12.5%. So for a great-great-grandparent, it's 6.25%. With 6%, that makes sense. So if it is coming from that great-grandparent's line, what he would want to look for is for the parents of that great-grandparent, what are their names and where did they come from? Because if it's just from one ancestor, more than likely it's going to be through one of those parents of that great-grandparent. But we also need to consider it could be coming through multiple lines. It could be very distant on multiple lines. It certainly makes sense. Being that Italy is in the Mediterranean, there were migration and trade routes going through Spain and Portugal, so it's certainly possible that Italian is one of those things that could come up. Even though we hypothesize and try to think of, well, what makes the most sense, it's good to consider other things as well, not just what's the best possible thing in your mind. What are different possibilities?
But you know that it's in the DNA there. And then the France, 22% with the French portion. And, you know, I'm figuring that this may be from the French Basque people because just, you know, along my paternal line, that comes from the north of Spain, from my father's line, grandfather, and so on and so forth.
So that makes sense. If it's coming through his father's side, 22% would be the equivalent if it's coming from one ancestor. It'd be the equivalent of coming from a grandparent. If his father is from North Spain and both of his father's parents are from North Spain, you know, basically tracing back, he has a lot of ancestry tracing to Santander, Basque region, you know, other parts of northern Spain, then it certainly could make sense. And it's very likely that if his father were to test, then we would also see his father getting a big French reading and then having his father's parents test. We would probably see French in both of them as well. So it would be interesting if he is able to get his father or his grandparents or all of them to test. He could find some really interesting things going on.
It's right there hugging that region where it goes right up into France. And there's the French Basque people and all that. So I don't see a problem with... Now, it's pretty darn high, 22%, but just the same... it's probably, who knows if it's lumped in with Spain or it's separate because it's bad. We can't say, but there it is.
That's a good point. It could also be the fact that maybe because of the connections between people in northern Spain and people in France and the Basque region, all of that, that it's just so hard to decipher the DNA between those that what really might actually be northern Spain is being defined as French just because it's so common among more French population, or it could be vice versa. There's all sorts of possibilities.
And then we have the 3% Ireland and Scotland. Okay, there is Celtic connections with, you could research that. It may seem like a strange thing. You always think, of Spanish origin, at least in the Americas, there. You have to take things historically into consideration. There's lots of testing DNA-wise, and I've read a lot. If you're of Cuban ancestry and have done one of these DNA tests, leave the results down there if you'd like to share. If you have any questions or want to tell a story, feel free to do so. I hope that you guys enjoyed it and that it's useful for you. Subscribe if you'd like, and I'll catch you guys next time.
All All right, that was a really good video. He did it in the way that I want people to do these DNA tests. Trace your family tree as best possible. Now, I know that not everyone can. Adoptees, people with unknown parentage, all sorts of other situations can cause it so that it's really, really difficult to build a family tree. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't try. And a lot of people are truly able to build family trees, and that's really the best thing. Build the family tree, get a true understanding of where that ancestry is coming from, and then when you take the DNA test, it makes more sense. I think one thing that's quite obvious, and probably one reason why I like this video a lot, is he seems to be doing this DNA test in conjunction with his genealogy more than just doing the genealogy to better understand his DNA test. Just the fact that he even mentions the matches and talks about, how you can help break brick walls in your tree, I'm guessing that's what he's actually doing. And since this video is from 2019, I wonder, has he been able to break through those? As I said in the beginning, it would have been quite interesting to see his DNA matches, especially being that he's Cuban, and more than likely he will be dealing with endogamy, which basically just means that he's going to have matches where they seem much closer than they truly are. Often what it means is, someone will pop up and it'll say they're maybe a third to fifth cousin. Well, in reality, they're actually closer to maybe like a sixth or seventh cousin, but they're a sixth or seventh cousin in different ways. So maybe they're a sixth cousin through your mom's side, but then they're also a sixth cousin through your dad's side. And then the DNA that you're getting through your dad's side, the DNA you're getting through your mom's side that's matching that cousin, well, it adds up, and then it's twice as much as it would be if you were just a single sixth cousin, and then it looks like they're closer. But overall, as I said, this really was a great video. I think he understood things really well. I'd be curious to see what his results are now, but I definitely will want to put more Cuban DNA result videos on my list of reactions, just because I am a bit surprised to see he had no African and no Native American ancestry, where in my experience with a lot of Cuban DNA results, there will often be some sort of that African or Native American ancestry within the results. Well, thank you so much for checking out this video. I do hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. It really does help me out. You can also click right about here if you'd like to subscribe. It is completely free to do so. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at GeneaVlogger. I'm the GeneaVlogger. See you in my next video.